Take a look at this graph. This is War Thunder's Steam player count over the past 3 months. We had an all-time peak back when Nuclear Thunder happened in April, and we've been on a steep decline since. Looks bad, right? It's easy to see where all those scary thumbnails are coming from. But what happens if we zoom out? Suddenly, it seems like things aren't so bad after all. In fact, we might even be at the tail end of a rising trend in player counts. So, what's the truth? Well, as with many things, the truth isn't quite so simple. It turns out that humans are not very good at extracting useful data from time series visualizations like this. Thankfully, however, we've invented algorithms to help. Let's do a time series decomposition on this data using Meta's open source Prophet library. The algorithm fits periodic, weekly, and yearly trends using the entire 13-year dataset. As it turns out, folks play more on weekends and during the winter. Informative, but not super interesting. But now, look at this. This is the global trend that remains after the periodic effects have been filtered out. Now, the picture is clear. War Thunder isn't quite dying yet, but it's currently experiencing the longest period of stagnation that it's ever seen, and overall, it appears to be in a slow decline. Given that this is the case, though, it begs a deeper question. What is the actual state of War Thunder in the summer of 2026? Is the game still attracting new players, or is it mostly being held up by veterans who refuse to quit? What proportion of new players actually manage to stick with it in the long run? What game modes are people actually playing? What battle ratings? What vehicles? Answering these questions, however, requires a whole lot more than just the player counts from Steam. But if we had the answers to these questions, we as a community could support our feedback and criticism with actual statistics from the game itself, which, as we know, seems to be the only language that Gaijin actually speaks. So that is what I want to help contribute to this community. Because while I don't really think my personal complaints about the game are particularly unique or even interesting, I do have something else I can bring to the table. I am a professional data analyst. So let's start with the data. What do we actually need? Well, to calculate population statistics for War Thunder, we need a population of War Thunder players. That much is obvious. What's not so obvious is how many players we actually need. So, I phoned up an expert.
So let's start with a super basic question, which is, if all we cared about was just to get this snapshot, how many players, unique players, do we actually need in order for this histogram to be informative? Like, what's your ballpark answer?
This is my good friend Max. Max is a PhD student studying forest ecology at Stanford University. Max does population statistics day in and day out. Max does not play War Thunder.
So I would say, 1,000 would get you an interesting answer. 10,000 would probably get you like a good answer.
Okay.
100,000 would get you a definitive answer. It would probably be the numbers that I would give.
Okay. So I have some data collection to do.
As you can imagine, this is where things get a little tricky. War Thunder does have a handy webpage that allows you to look up a player's lifetime stats if you know their username. So far so good, but unfortunately that requires me to somehow collect a representative sample of 100,000 usernames. The only player lists on the War Thunder website are the leaderboards, and for obvious reasons, we probably shouldn't be treating the leaderboards as a representative sample of the whole player population. And besides, even if we did, the leaderboards only go up to 20,000th place. I checked. So that leaves plan B. What if we collected matches instead, and then sampled usernames from their scoreboards? Luckily, there is a way to extract exhaustive match data from replay files using an open source tool called WT Plotter, and Gaijin does provide another handy web portal for downloading server replays. After some trial and error, I determined the following rules for how the matches seem to be listed on this site. Number 1, the matches with the latest start time are listed first. This seems to be the only way that matches are sorted in the list, regardless of game mode, assuming of course you're not filtering by game mode at the top of the page. Number 2, a match does not have to be over for its replay to become available. This is because server replays are now recorded in parts of 1 minute each. Once even a single part is available for download, the match will appear on the site. And in fact, sometimes matches that are listed on the front page will say still in progress and have no parts available for download at all, although this seems to be rare. The replay parts themselves are hosted on a separate website following this URL format. After understanding all of this, we can finally come up with a game plan for collecting our data. And here, it's worth taking a step back to summarize what exactly we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to get a representative snapshot of the current player population. That means choosing individual players using as random of a process as possible, and we're also trying to get at least 100,000 unique players for our dataset. As an order of magnitude estimate, that means we need about 10,000 matches. And as a fun little coincidence, there's just over 10,000 minutes in a week. So, I decided on the following approach. Once a minute, reload the replay page. Then, pick a random row and note down the session ID. Then, after waiting 3 hours, go to the corresponding URL for the replays associated with the session ID and download the largest numbered replay file that exists on the server. We wait 3 hours to ensure that even the longest game mode has a chance to finish so we can get the final replay part, which is guaranteed to have the full player list. To make a very long story short, I did this for the week directly following the Heavy Cavalry update, and I ended up with replay files from 10,952 matches. Now we're finally getting somewhere. Using the code from WT-Plotter, we can extract a ton of metadata from each replay file. We get stuff like the mode, the match length, and also individual lists of the vehicles used during the match, and also the players who participated and their corresponding match statistics. Think number of kills and score. So with all of this organized into one dataset containing all of the collected matches, we can immediately get a ton of interesting information. Let's start with a big impressive pie chart. So here is a breakdown of the popularity of each game mode. One thing to note is that because each match can only show up once on the replay site, shorter game modes are going to be overrepresented in the data because multiple short matches have more opportunities to be picked up by our random sampling procedure than a single long match. So for this visualization, I compensated for this by weighting each game mode by its average match length. Also, I took out all the really rare modes like Helicopter PvE and also the ongoing events like Nuclear Thunder just to clean up the data a little bit. Now, I know some people are allergic to pie charts, so just for you folks, here's a bar graph with the same information. Realistic Air, Arcade Ground, and Realistic Ground are the 3 most popular game modes by far, followed by Arcade Air and Naval, and then Realistic Naval and Sim Air, and I guess nobody really plays Tank Sim. I think that lines up with most of our expectations, which is good because that gives us some confidence that our data is actually being collected properly. So now let's look at some of these modes in more detail and see what else we can discover. First, I want to apologize to all the Sim and Naval players because due to the small number of matches from these game modes that I actually managed to collect, I'm not really comfortable speculating on trends, so I won't be able to discuss these game modes in detail for pretty much the rest of this video. I'm sorry. With that out of the way, the first thing that I want to dig into is battle rating spread. So what battle ratings are most popular in what game modes? This is something that I've only ever been able to speculate about before, but now with this dataset, I can finally get an answer. And here it is. For Ground Arcade, the reserve tiers seem especially popular, while in Ground RB, there is a very heavy skew towards top tier. Air RB is also extremely heavily skewed towards top tier, with over 70% of matches happening above BR 13.0. Air Arcade, on the other hand, seems to be bimodal, with 27% of matches happening below BR 3.0 and another 33% above BR 12.3. And note that for these graphs, I've also compensated for that bias towards shorter matches by weighting each BR bracket by its average match length, which is an excellent segue to talking about those match lengths. For arcade in both air and ground, the BR bracket of a match doesn't seem to have much of an effect on the actual match length, other than maybe a small increase in average match times toward the middle battle ratings. The realistic modes, however, are a bit of a different story. For both of these modes, there is a noticeable drop in the average match length from mid to high tier. In Ground RB, this happens from BR 8.0 to 12.0, and in Air RB, this seems to happen from BR 8.7 to around 12.7. For Air RB in particular, I can pretty confidently say that this reduction in match lengths is due to missiles getting more deadly, and therefore making it easier to kill people more quickly. But I don't play much Ground RB, so I'm curious to hear any explanations for that in the comments. Another dimension I'm interested in is team sizes, especially because of all that discussion around reducing team size in high-tier Air RB matches specifically. Gaijin did add this toggle that lets you opt into 12v12 matches in Air RB. Has it actually done anything? Unfortunately, the answer seems to be no. The toggle seems to have had basically zero effect on the actual average team sizes at the battle ratings where it's supposed to be active. In fact, the only battle rating ranges in Air RB that have less than 16 players per team on average are at low tiers, where presumably the matchmaker is being forced to reduce team sizes due to the lack of players. In Ground RB, even this doesn't seem to have an effect, and teams are just always 16v16. Ironically, Arcade actually seems to be better about team sizes, although in the case of Air Arcade, this might also just be because there aren't very many people playing it. All in all, it does seem like the matchmaker tries very hard to fill out full 16-player teams in most circumstances. The replay metadata also lists all of the vehicles in each match, so I was curious about vehicle popularity across different game modes. Now, it turns out that this particular analysis is actually available on StatShark, and they have way more data than I do, so their numbers are going to be a lot more accurate. Even so, I think it's fun to see what we can deduce just from this 1 week's worth of sample data. For the record, the rest of these visualizations in this video are not currently available on StatShark, and on that note, I do think it would be pretty cool if StatShark allowed raw data exporting, because that would have saved me about 2 weeks of effort collecting all this data myself. In any case, the most useful takeaway from this visualization might just be seeing what premiums are making Gaijin the most money. From the Air RB chart, it's easy to see that high-tier premiums are extremely popular. So popular, in fact, that 8 out of the 10 most popular vehicles across the entire game mode are pack premiums. Now, this was right after the summer sale, so maybe this high concentration of premiums will chill out after a few months, but even if that's the case, that just goes to show that these things are selling like hotcakes. Particularly, we can conclude that the SU-30 MK2 AMV is the best financial decision that Gaijin has ever made, given that it makes the leaderboards not only in Air RB, but also Air Arcade, and it's even 9th place in Ground RB. What? You know, the game mode that's supposed to be about tanks. Okay, now let's take a step back, because this still isn't actually the final dataset. Remember, we still have to collect the individual player profiles, and as it turns out, these 10,952 matches contain 203,725 unique players. Of these, it turns out about 3,000 of them changed their nicknames by the time that I tried to look them up, and a further 68 had no valid registration date, which means I couldn't use them for this analysis, leaving me with a final count of 200,622 player profiles that I downloaded individually and then sorted into a nicer database format for analysis. So, let's do some more data visualization. At this point, however, I do have a confession to make. When I first started scripting this video, the title was going to be something along the lines of, "War Thunder is dying, I can prove it with statistics," and this was going to be the smoking gun. I thought I'd discover something like this. A bimodal playtime distribution showing new players rapidly falling off the game, and a second peak where longtime veterans were still stubbornly holding on. That was my whole hypothesis going into this, that War Thunder's heyday was behind it, and the only reason that player counts aren't dropping off yet is because there is still a large dedicated player base that formed back when the game was healthier. In reality, however, this is simply not the case. The actual playtime distribution looks downright unremarkable. You have this big peak of new players as they enter the game, and a slow, gradual decline as the total playtime increases. This is pretty much what you would expect of any game, really. And in fact, you could even argue that there are signs that the game is doing pretty well. The median playtime is almost 500 hours. That means 50% of active players have over 500 hours in the game. That's pretty substantial. If we change this graph to show account registration date instead of total playtime, player retention also looks pretty good, with sizable portions of the current population being old accounts that registered back in the beginning of War Thunder's history. There's another way that we can gain insight into War Thunder's historical growth, but this one is a bit unorthodox. So every player account has an associated integer ID. For non-console accounts, this ID is known to be assigned in roughly ascending order, so newer accounts have larger account IDs. So, what if we made a scatter plot of all the account IDs in the dataset versus their registration dates? Well, then we get this. Assuming there isn't anything weird and non-linear going on with how IDs are assigned, this line should be roughly proportional to the total number of PC War Thunder accounts in existence. I say proportional, not equal, because there definitely aren't over 200 million War Thunder accounts, but this can still be used to estimate the relative rate with which new players are arriving to the game. The point is, it looks like War Thunder has been attracting new players at roughly a constant rate since about 2023, because the slope of the line since then hasn't really changed. Now this is very important, but to explain why, I'll have to do some math, so please bear with me. We can think of War Thunder as a queue. New players arrive, play the game for however long, and then leave. So the length of this queue is then the size of the active player population. The simplest mathematical model for this kind of system is known as Little's Law, and according to Little's Law, the length of the queue is equal to the arrival rate, which in our case is how fast new players are coming to the game, multiplied by the residency time, which is how long players stay playing the game on average. Crucially, this assumes the system is in what is called a steady state. That is, the arrival rate is constant and the average residency time is also constant. So now let's go back to that user ID graph. The arrival rate to War Thunder has been pretty much constant since late 2023, and if you remember the CCU graph from the beginning of the video, War Thunder's average CCU seems to have peaked shortly after, and since then it's plateaued. In other words, Little's Law seems to be taking hold, which means the game has reached a steady state. Now, if we take the slight declining trend in CCU seriously, in combination with the constant arrival rate, we can deduce that the residency time must also be decreasing, because that's the only way for the queue length to be getting shorter. Now remember, residency time in this model is just a fancy way of saying how much players are playing on average, which is a decent proxy for engagement in general. So in other words, War Thunder seems to still be attracting players, but the players might be getting less and less engaged over time. And that is my final verdict on the health of the game in the summer of 2026. The only question left to ask now is why? Why has War Thunder been in this state of stagnation for the past 2 years, especially considering its explosive growth just before? While I certainly don't have enough data to answer this question comprehensively, I do have a theory. Let's look at the final major update of 2023, Air Superiority. This was the update where we got the F-15, Su-27, and Gripen. 2 updates later, we got active radar homing missiles, and by the end of 2024, we had the Eurofighter Typhoon and the Rafale. What's even left at that point? And that's not even the biggest problem. The reality is, Gaijin's development model for War Thunder is long past its expiry date, and I'm certainly not the first person to say so. War Thunder has always been about its vast selection of high-fidelity vehicles. It's all over their advertising, it's the main draw to the game. But that only works to an extent. War Thunder in 2026 is a mile wide and an inch deep, and I think the reason it's stagnating is players are waking up to that fact. It's clear from the data that the vast majority of players are here for the shiny modern vehicles, but the gameplay has not evolved to suit the capabilities of these vehicles whatsoever. The most popular battle rating brackets of the most popular game mode, which is high tier ARB, are a frustrating meat grinder of Fox 3 bullet hell that just completely erases the unique capabilities and attributes of all of the vehicles involved. And this just isn't fun. And if I feel that way with 4,000 hours in the game, imagine how somebody who just bought a shiny new SU-30 MK2 AMV as their very first War Thunder Premium must feel. Look, the way I see it, War Thunder is rapidly running out of runway. Not only because they're literally running out of modern vehicles to add, but because even if they had another century's worth of technology to add to the game, that would only further reveal just how shallow of a game it fundamentally is. But if I could collect and analyze all of this data in just 2 weeks with no access to Gaijin's internal databases, then the developers at Gaijin must also be aware of the situation. And recently they do seem to be trying out more new game modes with the return of Nuclear Thunder for air and Advance for tanks. So I can only hope that this is the beginning of a new trend where Gaijin refocuses on novel and improved gameplay experiences instead of just continuing to throw new toys into a decaying sandbox. Who knows, maybe the recent controversies and community backlash will help get them off their asses. Because one thing is certain, the clock is ticking, and it's going to take more than adding the F-22 to stop this stagnation from turning into a full-blown collapse. Okay, that's enough yapping. If you've made it this far, thank you, and please let me know what you think of my analysis or conclusions in the comments. I've uploaded the full datasets I collected to make this video as CSV files in a Google Drive folder, which I've linked in the description if you want to mess with the data yourself. I will not be sharing my code because I had to, let's just say, hop some fences to get the data collection fully automated. But if you have your own ideas for some kind of data analysis project and you want to collaborate, please feel free to reach out. I'll see you in the next one. Oh, and also, I never want to hear Gaijin use queue times as an excuse for not decompressing top tier ever again, because literally over half the player base is playing here. Raise the BR cap to 20.0 immediately. Okay, bye for real.